When I think back on all of these years, the ones that I can remember, I did not really get interested in history until I started working in the civil rights movement. And the work that I did was working on various ways of getting Black people to be not only the recipients of programs that were being done for them, but to have them be running those programs. There were actually people from the suburbs who would drop off garbage so they wouldn't have to pay dumping fees in their hometowns. So we decided that we should clean it up and pile it all up in one big pile of garbage. And then some young people said, you know what? We should burn it. And this young guy comes over to me and he says, let's burn it down, let's burn it down. I said, let's burn it down. No. So the fire department is already there. We start pulling the hose back. Now, we had watched people being hosed on television in the South, but we had no experience about what that was like. And the fireman who was at the nozzle simply turned around. And we just got pushed all the way over, literally to almost the other side of the park. What we had forgotten about was there were photographers there. And so the next day, on the front page, Black people being hosed down. It took them a week to clean up the park. A neighbor comes to me and he said, someone told me that you were involved in getting that fire going. I said, well, a lot of us were. And he said, I want to talk to you about this idea they have for buying our houses and turning it into a high school. And I do, and that's how we organized what was then called the Lower Roxbury Community Cooperation, which is now Madison Park. And it turned out to be one of the first CDCs, Community Development Corporations in America.
When I hear the name of Byron Rushing, I want to bow. I went to him to ask him if he would help put together this Green Book tour. I knew that he would be good and have an interest about what was going on in the South End when the Green Book was being used by millions of folks to have their dignity respected when they came to Boston or any other places during that Jim Crow era. When Byron and I get an opportunity to talk to young people, this is all new history to them. And we're in the middle of the swing back. You know, we had Emancipation Proclamation and then it was the pushback. Okay, Jim Crow, Plessy versus Ferguson. And then we have the Green Book, which is a response to that. And so, while it might not be something that gets put in a museum, or the Green Book tour that Byron has created is part of preservation history. It's done in another way, but a very important way at this point in time.
You cover that, like, from civil rights advocacy to forming a CDC. Where did the idea of, like, I'm going to be a museum director?
That's right. It comes from a question that I had never thought about, but kept getting asked. And that is, why is the Black community in such bad shape? Especially people who had moved here from the South, who had heard about Boston in their history books. And that was the first thing I had to tell people is, number one, all the abolitionists' grandchildren are dead. And when I was doing that, I started meeting people who were trying to do this work of teaching this history. They named themselves the American Museum of Negro History. And at one point, one of the members of that organization says to me, you know, the oldest Black church in Boston is still standing, which was then a synagogue. Yeah. And so I walk up there and it's completely locked up. The back door is open. So I push the door open and I go into the African meeting house. So the first time I went into the African meeting house was as a trespasser. So when they were ready to sell the building, one of the first places they went to was to try to find black organizations that might want to buy it. And so we negotiated that, and we're able to expand. And so those two buildings now form the Museum of Afro-American History in Boston. And that became probably the way that most black people at that time were introduced to the African Meeting House and to the whole idea that black people were in before the South End and before Roxbury.
Byron Rushing served as trustee of the Boston Public Library for 9 years. I was incredibly impressed by Byron's passion for the library, for the people of Boston, and often for his personal counsel on how to get the library to do the right thing. One of the areas that I remember him being especially passionate about was the neighborhoods of Boston and all of the communities that we serve, but in particular, his commitment to ensuring that Roxbury got its due in the city of Boston always came through in his passion for his work. He has had the perfect balance of community organizer blended with public servant, blended with local historian.
What was your then kind of motivation to be like, oh, you know, preservation museums are great, but what if I was a state rep?
Well, for me, the defining piece was Mel King. He ran for mayor once, and it was just like symbolic. But in that race, he decides, oh no, I can win this, and decides not to run for a state representative. I was a member of my ward committee and all that kind of stuff, and so we have a meeting, and people go around, wouldn't you like to do this, Byron? Wouldn't you like, and then someone pulls out a check that he's written to me. And then I realized I was completely taken, right? That they had already had a meeting.
You were one of the first to sponsor a gay rights bill.
That's right, it was a few of us. When I went door to door, this woman asked me what my position was on rent control, and I told her I was in favor of rent control, and she said, well, that's it. I'm not gonna vote for anybody that's gonna support rent control. About a week or two later, I see her on the street, and she says, oh, I wanted to talk to you. Someone told me that you would endorse a gay rights bill. I said, yep, that's right. And she said, forget everything else I said to you.
You learned a couple of things. She owns a building.
Forget everything else I said to you. You know, the next big issue for us, of course, was marriage, right? But we were able to do it.
Byron served on the board of directors of the Urban Ministry when I arrived 11 years ago. He was one of the early board members who I met with. He really grounded my understanding of the history, in particular as it relates to race in Boston and in the United States. And he really provided me a foundation for understanding the work that we do here. And so I'm one person, so I multiply that times the thousands of people who've had an opportunity to hear him. So I can only imagine how significant the effect he has had on Boston's understanding.
I am hopeful for this future, and as I try to remind people now, even with what's going on at this instant, for black people, we have overcome worse. And we don't talk about what was worse in our history. When we talk about war, we talk about how heroic it was that Americans got involved in World War II, but we don't tell them much about how World War II started. We don't teach fascism in school. We don't. But that's why we were there. That's why all of these Americans died. But we only learn about the heroic part. We're not prepared for when the bad part starts again.
He deserves every accolade, every award, and certainly is very deserving of this award. So I just say congratulations, Byron.
You have such a giving heart and a brilliant mind, and the combination of the two makes you an extraordinary human being.
I would just like to personally congratulate Byron and Frida, who is part of his work for sure. Thank you for your friendship and your counsel. I hope through this award people learn more about a lifetime's legacy of work and impact on Boston and its people, and making it an even better place to live and be.